Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Hivemind. This time we're going to do a deep dive into regenerative agriculture and energy innovations from COVID-19. This discussion is a follow-on to a conversation that we had last week, which was focused on benefiting the planet. And in that one, we had really quite a fantastic deep dive into different opportunities that are currently arising, or different risks if we squander those opportunities in COVID-19 to benefit our planet. After that session, we had like a little power out on what are potential deep dives that could be arising from this super big problem and big topic. And, even there, the brackets that were opened range from everywhere from agriculture to oceans, to soil, to energy. And so we won't be able to do all of this justice in today's session at all. That being said, I'm tremendously honored to have like three fantastic panelists on here who very specific, are rethinking quite across the board. And so I'm really happy to have Creon Levit here from Planet Labs, who's obviously here in his capacity as mad scientist at Planet Labs, but has been joining I think almost every single one of those iterations of the Salon now on a daily basis. So thank you for doing that, Creon. And next one up, we have David Brown. David, I was introduced to, luckily, I think maybe a little over a year ago to interview him on climate destabilization chapter for a book on existential hope as an onboarding document for the next generation that we're currently writing. And he gave us, I think, a really good download on agriculture and the considerations that different folks involved in agriculture have. And so I'm really happy to have you here. You are also part of last week's discussion on this. And then finally, I'm super thrilled that we could get Saul Griffith to join this meeting today. Saul is leading the Otherlab in San Francisco, which apparently Creon took me to a holiday party to, I think last year or the year before. So thanks for smuggling me in there, Creon. It's a really incredible space, like totally fantastical, but it's not really the location that makes it so nice or that makes Otherlab special. Otherlab is a really quite a fantastic independent research and design lab that really pairs creativity, I think, with a really pragmatic approach to change and is focusing on solutions in renewable energy and robotics. I think, they have raised, I think, over 70 million in research and design contracts over a few years and amassed 100 million in follow-on capital and spun out 12 companies. So I'm super happy to have you join here, Saul, as well. And I think I'm incredibly excited to be launching in this conversation on specifically focusing on regenerative agriculture, but also on energy, on potential energy solutions that are available now due to COVID-19. I also want to mention David Brown was previously at RPE, is now at Pivot Biolab. So I'm hoping also to get from you a perspective on kind of like the soil opportunities and risks that we're facing due to COVID-19. And Saul is working on a book. I'm hoping maybe you can share a little bit of insights without giving too much away on specifically on green energy. So those are, I think, just a few threads that I would love to pull on with you. I'm really grateful that you are able to join. This is definitely a big Pandora's box to open. But I think it's one that is ever more pressing. I think, sometimes we talk about COVID-19 as the first time where, the planet has to coordinate on a common threat or on a common problem. That's obviously not the case, right? I think the threat of climate destabilization and its effect on I think, conscious creatures in the biosphere is really, I think, a looming one that we should have coordinated on much earlier, and we haven't really gotten around to it yet. So I'm really happy that we're tackling this particular aspect of this also much larger looming risk that many of us will be facing if we're lucky enough to live that long. Okay, well, with that chirpy introduction, I'm really happy to have you here, and I would love to dive right into it.
It's great to be here. I don't want to make it seem like regenerative agriculture is the only thing anybody has to do that's of any benefit. Far from it. However, I do think it's one of the things that we could pivot towards on a planetary scale that would it's one of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of how much benefit it could create across the board in a lot of different areas, and how little is required in terms of activation barrier, in terms of like you don't really need breakthroughs in technology. You don't need trillions of capital. You don't need massive shifts in human nature. Okay, it's one of these things. It's a variety of things. There's a number of principles of regenerative agriculture, but it's a thing that is doable. It's doable now. It's doable without invoking all sorts of leaps of faith or magic or breakthroughs or low probability events. And it could benefit in many ways. So, I mean, basically, it can benefit human health. It can benefit the biosphere and the environment. It can benefit the climate, which really, I would maintain, we mostly want to benefit, because how benefiting the climate is for the benefit of the biosphere. It's not like the climate is important in and of itself. It's important for living creatures and conscious creatures and all that stuff. So it can benefit human health. It can benefit the biosphere. It can benefit the economy in terms of, we have this terrible situation now where farmers are going bankrupt and committing suicide in large numbers, and the third world farming situation is also very messed up. It can reverse a lot of those things and make them great. It can, lastly, I would say, it can, in a related manner, benefit the resiliency of our food system. So this will be the last thing I discuss. It's not by no means the last benefit, but as we've noticed, has come to the fore with COVID, but as the people watching knew for quite some time, our existing food system, particularly in the industrialized nations, particularly in the United States, is brittle, fragile, environmentally destructive, unhealthy, and let's just focus on the brittle, fragile part, where certain events that we thought were low probability, like pandemics, but which may not be, can disrupt the food system. And so regenerative agriculture, which has one of the aspects is it has more of a local customization to it, as opposed to industrial agriculture, which arguably does not. It's more resilient, it's more distributed, it's more anti-fragile. So there's a lot of advantages to this, and it's not that hard to do. We know how to do it. Nature has provided us basically with everything we need. We don't need super technology, although technology would always help. So end of spiel, and I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I love the word more anti-fragile. It's like, I think one to unpack, given the definition of anti-fragile, is like the opposite of fragile. Okay,
so it's less fragile. It's less subject to catastrophic failure with just small perturbations.
Well, but it gets stronger under pressure. That's right, the definition that Taleb uses for anti-fragile. So, that's, I think, the interesting dichotomy here. Okay, without wanting to talk too much on words here, I would love to hear maybe from David to bring us up to speed. And David, you have you have now shaving your hair, and the beard looks different too. So thank you so much for coming on again.
I just call my beard gets bigger every week of quarantine. But my hair is also growing longer. I thought it was the sides. I thought the sides were shaved. Just exposed it a bit better. Okay. I really appreciate Creon's points. I think one thing that I noted was, like he mentioned, like there isn't the need for large technological change. And I think that's true, but there's a lot of needs for small technological change. And one of the things, my grandfather was a soil scientist, and the way he would collect soil samples was by taking a steel tee and driving into the grounds with his hip. This is the same way that people take soil samples today, with almost no even basic iteration on ergonomics over 60 years. With agriculture and sustainability, I see a systems problem, and this is very similar to energy, in which people at the end of the supply chain care a lot about it, having these benefits to it. But the people at the front of the supply chain, the farmers or the power companies, are basically price takers and not price makers. And so they're, the way that sustainability payments, sustainability preference in food gets translated to the farmer is very often a food company saying, hey, why don't you make this according to these new practices, and we will pay you the exact same amount for those foods, right? And if you can get money systematically going from the people who really care about driving sustainability into the supply chain and get it to the people who have the ability to make those changes, you'll start to see things moving a bit faster.
All right. Also a really good short brief pitch. I'd love to hear from Saul.
Saul's muted.
I'll unmute myself. Does that work?
Yes.
So I'm new to the salon, so I don't have much context for how this conversation works. But what I am working on in this pandemic is finishing up a book on end game decarbonization. And what do I mean by that? We are basically at the last moment in history with a chance of coming in under 2 degrees. Meaning if we don't start that project roughly this year or next year at something like a wartime mobilization effort, we lose all chance of staying under 2 degrees unless you assume some magical massive carbon air capture project working later in the century. And unfortunately, all of the IPCC models and the models that are popularized in the media, it's not really widely known, but they assume negative emissions later this century to hit their targets, which is why one of 2 reasons that we're underwhelming on our ambitions on carbon emissions. The other is that we haven't factored in, or not in a popular sense, factored in committed emissions. And I think this is a really important point. So this is sort of where my book starts is, so what is the reality of our climate picture? And then it goes around, how do you actually achieve 2 degrees? So on committed emissions, every machine has a natural lifetime. So if a car that lasts about 20 years, your furnace lasts about 30 years, your refrigerator lasts 11 years. Fossil fuel plants last 50 or 60 years. If we allow every machine that already exists today to live out its natural life burning fossil fuels, that will consume emissions that take us close to 2 degrees, beyond 1.5 and close to 2. So what is the logical consequence of that? That means at every single purchasing decision for everyone in humanity, starting approximately now, we need to choose the machine that doesn't end in net carbon. So that means electric vehicles at every vehicle choice. That is what is technically required in an engineering sense to stay under 2 degrees without assuming negative emissions. So that's pretty humbling, and unfortunately is sort of not where the conversation on climate change is, because the conversation is sort of driven by economists, unfortunately, in discussions of carbon taxes, as opposed to, what is the reality of replacing machines. So from there, I'm basically in a mode this year of doing whatever I can politically and in public communication sense, trying to help people understand that that's the reality, and then what do you need to do to counter that effort. And we still have an opportunity. So if we did a equivalent wartime mobilization to what the US did in World War II to help win the war for the Allies, but we focused instead of Liberty ships and tanks and airplanes on wind turbines, solar cells, heat pumps, electric vehicles, we probably would be at scale in a manufacturing sense in 4 to 5 years. And then with 10 years of consistent production and replacement of existing machinery by 2035, we could hit the required target and infrastructure changeover to stay under 2 degrees. Maybe this is the positive news story in the otherwise nightmare that is COVID. We've lost about over 30 million jobs in the past few months. If you use traditional economists' methodologies for estimating the job creation of a wartime build-out, like I just said, you would actually need to create 40 to 60 million jobs in the US economy to hit those targets. So maybe, just maybe, we're at a political moment where we're going to do Rooseveltian throwdowns, and that is what is required if we want any hope to stay under 2 degrees. That's just speaking of the 85% of emissions that are energy. Obviously, we also need the 10 to 15% that come from land use and agriculture to also come to the table in the next 2 decades. So, humanity is a fairly fragile moment if you contemplate that reality.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if one of you guys has read The Precipice, which is a new book that Toby Ott brought out, and he was basically talking about climate as a potential existential risk or not. And he was, he goes into, if we burned all the fossil fuels that we currently have available, we're more looking at 9 to 13 degrees total warming. I think until 2300. And he's basically saying like, okay, let's not really go there, but also what's stopping us? And I think like that number was totally insane. I thought, because even I think many of the current 2 to 3 models don't even take into account like I think later effect, right? I think he was bringing up a point about potential like a moist greenhouse gas effect as well. I don't know if you're looking at any of the kind of like more the more extreme scenarios as well in the book, or are you just saying
it's really not a book about climate science, and it's not with prosecuting the climate science, and particularly after it goes non-linear with feedbacks? That's what his book is referencing. We honestly, it's a joke to think that we can really model the non-linearities beyond, if we lose all of the methane class rates, it's all, all bets are off. That's why people have drawn a fairly firm line in the sand at 2 degrees, that we should stay under that because it goes non-linear after that. But, the best scientists that I know are now concerned that 2 degrees is too high, and even 1.5 gets us too close for comfort to those feedbacks. So really, it's not a book about climate science. All I would like to draw attention to is that the public conversation about climate science, we have been misled. One, by the lobbying groups that allowed us to believe that we were going to be able to do large negative emissions. And let's just be frank, that is thermodynamically insanely difficult and extremely unlikely to happen later this century, even with all the technology optimism you can muster. And then the other is that we don't factor in the committed emissions of existing infrastructure when we look at trying to hit the climate target. So I just say, let's call 2 degrees as risky as you'd like to go, given the possibility of feedbacks. Let's then not allow for negative emissions, because that's just, pipe dreams. And let's account for the natural turnover in machinery. That's the engineer's view, whereas unfortunately we have too many economists who don't think that machines exist talking about climate science. And then you're in the position, okay, well, that's the job that has to be done. Now, how do we do that? I also strongly believe we are now at a moment where the economics has shifted. Globally, 70-something% of new electricity infrastructure built last year was zero carbon. So we're already in the majority in the build out every year. So those trends are solid. And then if you could take the price of solar in Australia, because we had market mechanisms and regulations there that got it really cheap, you could take heat pump policy from Germany and Northern Europe, and you could take California's electric vehicle model. If we applied that in the US economy and those prices and those structures, you would actually save the average American home $1,000 to $2,000 a year today without any more price drops in those things. That does mean you have to have proactive legislation that gets rid of the biases in our energy system and the economics of such that are driven by fossil lobby. But, I think there is a good news story. If we do it right and we don't allow the regulations to screw it up, which is things humans are good at, then we could actually not only avoid 2 degrees, but save everyone money. So I'm not trying to do the naive, you should all suck up double the energy price. We have arrived where we can do it. The problem is social and political barriers.
All right, thank you. And I think you already kind of touched at the next point, that I want to get to, which is basically like, okay, 2 degrees is definitely bad enough. Let's think about, ways in which kind of like COVID-19 could actually potentially produce risks of of us slowing down even our progress there, but also B, what are kind of specific opportunities right now that perhaps weren't available before that we could leverage. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was already kind of like reskilling folks and getting them actually employed and helping with the tremendous wartime effort that would be required to do this right. Do you have perhaps a few others? And I would love to hear from other panelists as well. Are there specific opportunities right now which we should be pointing to as specifically promising to kind of to get our act together in your sectors?
I'd like to say something, if I may, Allison. And if it's okay with you, before jumping into the COVID opportunity that you alluded to in your question, I'd like to bring up something which I think may be a possibly useful prerequisite to that conversation, which is, I mean, a lot of people in this community and on these salons tend to be technophiles, and even Saul talked about, the pipe dream. If you, maybe he was calling it a pipe dream. I don't mean to put words into his mouth. Of massive machinery that could pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and how that.
I agree.
Okay, so all right, but let me tell you, I'm not sure it's a pipe dream in the following sense. What if I told you, there's a nanotechnology solution that can globally scale quickly and pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's a self-replicating, self-healing technology that requires no breakthroughs and no investment. Basically, it's plants and fungi and ruminant animals and rebuilding the soil and things that nature has already provided to us, which we just need to pivot towards and scale. And we can, as someone has been pointing out in the chat and is well known, we can go agriculture, and including ranching, of course, in there, can massively do negative emissions. Aquaculture can do massive negative emissions.
Not massively to the scale of our carbon emissions.
Yeah. I have to agree with
for one order of magnitude off.
I have to agree with Saul on this. I mean, when we built the carbon program at ARPA-E, I was thinking of as how do we buy a few years to steer the ship, right? And inevitably, and as Allison said, if we burn all the oil in Saudi Arabia, we're going to hit 2 degrees of global warming. Whether or not we do the most optimal soil carbon program on the planet. I am kind of curious how you think about the politics of it, Saul, because you kind of alluded to this sort of thing where if you do stuff in soil carbon sequestration, you get to meet oil industry people who are super excited about using it as an excuse to not change. And I wonder how do you think about how we should be advancing policy with respect to soil carbon?
Is it possible to share screen? Can I do that?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay.
If you're a co-host, so
I just happen to have this. Hopefully, you're looking at a Sankey diagram that has 4 colors on it.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay.
Oh, now we can.
This is U.S. material flows. This is millions of tons of all of the things that we move as a species. So yellow is non-metallic minerals. So the thing that we move in the greatest amount is limestone and sand and gravel and crushed rock. And that should be obvious because we have an awful lot of roads and concrete and buildings that are made out of that. Red is metal ores, all of the metals. Copper is silver. So that's the ores. That's not the refined metal. That's just the dirt that you have to sift through to find the metal. Biomass. So this is all of the biomass that humans interfere with. That's the green one in the middle there. And at the top is fossil fuels. What is amazing to you is that this is just the carbon in the fossil fuels. Remember that you would have to multiply that by 3 or 4 in terms of the mass of carbon dioxide produced by those fossil fuels. So the single one thing that humanity moves in volume more than every other thing that humanity moves otherwise is carbon dioxide. And that should humble you as to, even if you are doing some incredible net 10% per, biomass retention, you can't catch up to what we're doing in carbon dioxide. So it's just I think that's a sort of mind-blowing perspective on the scale of the challenge. As to the politics, I think there's a few things.
Saul, I want to interrupt for a sec. Could you go back to the slide and explain one more thing about what it's showing, which is the what are the inputs on the left and what are the outputs on the right? Is this atmospheric CO2 or is this something else?
No. So this on the black bar on the far left, this is all of the millions of tons of stuff that humans move, whether they shovel to do it or a plow or
a smokestack.
Or a smokestack. 6,544 million tons. This is the US, but the global is actually proportionally, the proportions are very similar. You can see at the top there, that's fossil fuels. You can then break fossil fuels down into petroleum, natural gas, coal, all the way down to things like coking coal and peat. This is biomass in the middle one there. And we can break that, we know that all the way down to what is sugar crops, what is rice and pulses. So what we move the most of, obviously, is cereals and straw and grazed biomass. So this is just the flows by tons of all the things that we interact with as humans. And again, you'd have to multiply, if you want to think about carbon dioxide, you've got to multiply the tonnage of the fossil fuels by somewhere between 3 and 4. So the single thing that we produce and move in the greatest quantity is carbon dioxide as a species. In fact, it's as much as everything else we move put together. I didn't put carbon dioxide here. This is just the fossil fuels, but you get the multiplier because you add oxygen to it. That makes sense, Creon?
Yeah, it makes sense and it's interesting. I'm not quite sure what the point is other than that it's interesting.
The point is to catch up to our production of fossil fuels, you have to the magical technology, I agree, exists. We have agriculture. Absolutely. It is the best possible pathway we have to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide. I think it's the only one that's likely to work at scale.
Other than throttling back on fossil fuels to begin with.
Other than throttling back. But the reality is that it's, our production of all of the other things is in this. Agriculture can't kinetically do it on the time frame required. It'll take 1,000 years for all of our agriculture to slowly sequester the carbon dioxide back out.
Okay, here's what kind of confuses me about the chart, and maybe I'm sure you have lots of charts like this, and I'd love to see them all, and maybe they'll be in your book or later in the talk, but like the green one here with just biomass, I understand that that's talking about the kilograms that humanity moves, if you will, but in a sense, there's kind of like a twin chart there for biomass, which is certain things that it's
soil.
Pardon me?
This doesn't have soil in it, right? And you would like to ultimately put the carbon into the soil.
Right, but what I mean is it's not clear from this diagram where we're taking stuff out and putting it into the atmosphere and where we're taking stuff out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ground. We're just talking about mass that's in flux in various places, right?
That's correct.
Okay, great.
You've
Thanks.
got the number times 4, which would be all photosynthesis on Earth minus all respiration on Earth, because I think we appropriate about 1/4 of Earth's photosynthesis right now. So that's kind of your number, and you're just going to say somehow we'll get a percentage of that sequestered by either getting in the soil or maybe chopping down trees and throwing them in big pits in the ground, which I've seen proposed and other ideas.
If it was spectacularly successful and we could of the biomass we move, 5% of it we could sequester, it still takes many centuries to put a dent in the carbon dioxide we've already put in the atmosphere. It is a giant sink, but the kinetics of it are too slow for the task. This graph does not show the kinetics. I could produce something like that. This was for another point, but it was the only one that I had and could bring up right now on 1 minute's notice to say, I think we are not aware of just the scale at which we produce carbon dioxide in tonnages compared to the other things that we move.
So on the kinetics, Saul, when I looked into the standard models, usually say that there's pools at different kind of residence time, and it takes that amount of residence time to fill them. And so you typically have like a 1 year, a 5 year, 20 year, 1,000 year pool. Yeah. And a lot of those models have a large percentage, 30 or 40% in those pools that you can start to fill in 10 years. So where are you getting your thoughts on like the kinetics necessarily being 1,000 or 10,000 years on soil?
So let's imagine that we take all the biomass that we pull up, and we don't eat any of it, and we bury it all, and none of it turns into methane, and no termites get to any of it, and it is perfectly sequestered. If we do that, yeah, we could, we could cancel our carbon dioxide output. Actually, we could do 1/4 of the carbon sequestration of our current output of carbon dioxide if we sequestered 100% of the biomass. Let's just admit that that's not what we would do. We might be able to do 1, 2, 3, 4% with some heroic amount of work. So we are off by, a time factor of 10 to 100. Yes, absolutely do it, but recognize it is a tiny drop in the carbon dioxide ocean, and the only thing that does this on the time frame required is decarbonizing our energy sector.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for clarification. Yeah, I agree with that completely.
Yeah, I'm not sure I do, but I understand what you're saying, and I look forward to seeing more details in your book and things like that. I mean, it's just
my book is not about sequestration.
Okay, all right.
Maybe it's interesting enough to add, but this you can imagine. The thought experiment: if I bury every single living thing every year, and that is still off by a factor of 4 of our carbon dioxide output, should give you a hint that we are way off.
Okay, but here's the thing, and maybe this is consistent with what you're saying, and I just don't understand. If you look, for instance, at the classic, I forget the name of the curve, the CO2 curve, which shows the rising over the centuries with the seasonal oscillation, you can sort of see with that seasonal oscillation how much is being pulled out of some part of how much is being pulled out of the atmosphere every growing season.
A 1/4 of ppm per year. It's called the Keeling curve. And the oscillation in the Keeling curve is about 1/4 of parts per million.
Right. So
and
with the
variation between the northern hemisphere having more trees than the southern.
Yes, right. And so I guess that should be consistent with your estimates of how much the global photosynthetic capture rate could contribute to decreasing. I mean, like, if you could, what I guess I'm wondering is, if you just stopped emissions, if you just stopped human CO2 fossil fuel emissions, what would the Keeling curve look like? It should turn around and start going down at about the rate that we see it go down in the Northern Hemisphere growing season.
I know the number that you want expressed in energy terms. I don't know it in carbon dioxide. So the total biosynthetic output is equivalent to 70 terawatts on land and 25 terawatts in the oceans. And about 2 terawatts, about 2% of that is naturally sequestered here.
The Keeling curve, Saul, is 5 ppm peak to peak annually, so it's a bit bigger than what you're putting out there. And I do agree with the larger point that we probably can get, at best, we can get a significant wedge on climate change with still carbon. But I don't agree that there certainly is more photosynthesis on Earth than there is carbon emissions, right? There's less in that diagram you showed because you're only showing where humans intersect with, right? And so I think these projects might be a little bit of a pipe dream, but the idea of like massive forest farms in order to do decarbonization still strike me as like, where they're not thermodynamically impossible. They may be logistically impossible, but they're not thermodynamically impossible.
But even if you do them, they aren't fast enough. You can't intone growing all of those forests and continuing it to use fossil fuels and having any hope of any climate target you want.
I think we're all in agreement about that. It's just, the question is, in my mind, it seems like it's a two-pronged approach. Like they're totally.
I don't know how we ended up having a fight, but
okay.
I'm all on all the carbon sequestration you can do, but I know that is maybe 2% of what we need.
I guess the only point I was trying to make is that I want to encourage people, rather than to think that the way to do it is to have giant solar farms, you're running hypothetical machines that quote unquote, human-made machines, artificial machines that quote unquote suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and, I don't know, make diamonds or make liquid CO2 or something, and instead deploy the sort of nature-given, self-replicating, self-repairing, beneficial on a whole bunch of other axes, soil sequestering machinery that is basically nature herself when correctly managed.
All right, I think that's a good segue back into the conversation of like thinking back on on COVID-19 and kind of like current risks and opportunities that you saw emerging there. I think Saul has kicked us off with one of them, but what do you currently see as an impetus for change that we should exploit more?
I'll jump on that hand grenade and answer David's question from earlier as well. He said, what are the political barriers? I think an underappreciated political problem is the problem of proven reserves. In roughly 1880, 1890, it was the first time we used fossil fuels that were in an oil well somewhere to finance the next oil well. So the guy wanted to drill a new hole, which cost you money, but he didn't have any cash. So we went to the bank and said, look, my old oil well is producing at this rate. Therefore, that's returning me this money. Therefore, you should lend me money for the next hole I drill. With that invention, we now have in effect financed and put onto the world's stock markets and into everyone's portfolios enough carbon reserves to take us well past 2 degrees up to 4 or 5 degrees. So I don't know how you solve the politics of climate change until you take that money off the table, because we've already, now if you use maybe the Saudi price of production of oil as the floor, because it's so cheap, it's about $7 a barrel of oil. If you apply that to all of the proven reserves we know, now not to answer, we shouldn't go into the question of whether all those proven reserves exist. That's an interesting question. Obviously, we have motivated fossil fuel companies to lie and exaggerate how much they have. But the total value of all the world's proven reserves is probably $100 trillion. So if somebody had allowed you to put $100 trillion in your bank account, are you going to want them to then say, no, you can't have that money anymore? And in essence, that is the argument that we all have when we wish to decarbonize. I quite frankly don't see any option out for us unless we somehow buy those out. But remember, we don't have to buy it out at the retail price. The fossil fuel industry is a horrible industry to be in. It's it's capital intensive, it's high risk, and you really only need to buy the fossil fuels out at the profit margin. Now,
which is negative right now, interestingly enough, correct? But
no, that's not true. The futures market is negative. That's not the actual price. That's a derivative bullshit thing. The real price is still positive, and there's a lot of people making money on it. America can't make money on it because the net price of making oil in America, the floor is about $20 a barrel. So that's why the Saudis always win in the end in these price wars, just because the cost of production here is higher. Anyway, I think we need to figure out how to take that money off the table. So then the naive version is, well, let's just buy these things out at the profit margin. And even though we are giving money to the quote unquote evil people, but remember they're the quote unquote evil people that gave us contemporary civilization and hospitals and plastics and all the things we love, even if we don't wish to love them. Maybe we say, here's a gold watch. Thank you for your years of service, fossil fuels. Here's $100 trillion. While the world is in the post-COVID mindset of printing money, and if we all agree globally to deflate simultaneously, we just buy out the fucking fossil fuel companies. We give them enough money and they're capitalized so that they can invest in the new energy economy the same way they do in the old energy economy. I think that's the biggest political challenge. The current left-leaning version of this is let's just wipe that money off the table. And I think we have a broken conversation politically. So maybe the giant grand bargain is some version of paying for that.
Well, another one is not just wiping off the table, but taxing, right?
I didn't catch it.
Carbon taxes. It's not just wiping it off the table.
Well, one might argue that giving them $100 trillion, which inflates everybody's currency, is taxing. It's just another way of doing it.
At the scale of the money transfers we're talking about, everything is either debt or tax. And I'm not sure that that's really the point. We set up, and if we go down the tax route or we go down we won't let we'll make it impossible. Both of those are politically difficult because the money already exists. We created the stock markets in some respects to provide this type of capital. This was naturally exploited by these companies. And so they've put it all on their balances. You can't wipe it off without causing a lot of people a lot of headaches, which is the resistance. So I think we need to wrestle with that Gordian knot. Otherwise, we can go barking at trees all we like. We're not going to solve this problem.
Hey, Saul, regarding the Gordian knot, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the following conundrum, which is in previous cases, not at the 100 trillion level, but at the large levels in this country and elsewhere, we have paid big companies and monopolies allegedly in exchange for changing their policies. And it turns out they're very happy to accept the payment, and then they just don't implement the policies, and then they're willing to pay the fines afterwards and keep the payments because it's worth it.
Sure. Absolutely. I in no way am I pretending that this is perfect. And obviously humans are as good at extortion and criminality as they are at anything else, and they'll probably figure out a way to fuck it up. But I actually would like to say, the US GDP is 22 trillion. The global GDP is over 100 trillion. The cost of World War II's response by America over the 5 years that we fought World War II was between 1.5 and 2 GDPs. So we won World War II with 1.5 to 2 GDPs.
Just the US.
That was the US's expenditure alone.
Right. Okay.
If the world only needs about 1 GDP to buy out those reserves. But it's not like you just give that money away and it all goes to Saudi royals to buy yachts. They will have to reinvest that somewhere. And they now, these are the companies, by the way, that do know how to build energy infrastructure. And we still, I think, will need some energy infrastructure. So you're sort of just giving them a head start. Again, I'm brainstorming. This may not be the best possible option, but we have to have a more viable political podium to stand on than we're going to take your $100 trillion back.
So if I understand it correctly, that was kind of based on the suggestion that anything else just won't fly because you have too many enemies, right? Because that money is kind of already in the bank. How are you going to do that counter proposal for everyone who will just scream, "What the hell?" That's the largest bailouts proposed in history. How can you kind of create that moral hazard for those companies in the first place? You're also creating an opposition on the other end.
Well, one of the things.
I'm glad we brought 3 physicists to this conversation.
One of the things that kind of falls out of Saul's proposal is you kind of need an international policing element, which is also, I read all of the primary candidates' climate plans, and there's a few of them, I think Buttigieg and Tom Steyer, who basically have that vision for America's future, right? So going from sort of the Cold War mentality of policing against communism to this mentality of policing against sort of climate violators. And I think that may be a real change. We'll see, maybe not in that form, but if the number one threat to the international order is seen as promoting climate change, you'll see sanctions against countries that violate those obligations.
All right. I think because if we talk about global, I think policing, we're opening up yet another bracket on top of this. And I would love to hear, from David and Creon as well. I think Saul came out there now with this proposal. Do you have any other risks and opportunities that you currently see that we should be jumping on, like particularly promising openings that you see in COVID-19?
Let me go a little further. Okay, let's talk about unemployment. Let's talk about jobs. So if you take the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I could show you this Sankey diagram too, but I'll spare you all more diagrams. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, as it currently measures it, 2.6 million people in the US are employed directly and indirectly by fossil fuels. 1 million of those are working in gas stations, and they're not really selling you gasoline as much as they're selling you corn syrup and tobacco. So really, in the energy provision side of the US economy, there's about 1.6 million people. It is well documented and well understood that solar and wind and renewables and even nuclear per unit of energy delivered employ many more people. And this can be fairly easily understood because instead of you're having to pay for labor instead of having to pay for fuels. Again, if you do a rough estimate on the ratio of jobs to energy produced for solar and wind today, and you did the multipliers through the economy, those things would employ 10 to 15 million people, whereas current energy employs 1.6 million people. So you could apply whatever discounts, because we'll get better at it in the future, that you like, but there is a very simple argument that you create any effort to decarbonize will create far, far, far more jobs than it destroys. And we have a moment in history where that may be very important in a lot of countries in the world.
Okay, I'd like to say something, which is, I'll get to how it's a COVID opportunity in a moment, but I kind of want to throw out there for David, Saul, and really anyone else, a question that is sort of analogous to the things that Saul was talking about for the fossil fuels. And that is, in a similar way to the energy sector, the food sector has a certain amount of inertia and regulatory capture and price taking and externalized costs that they don't have to pay for. And we have an opportunity, it seems, or potential, similar to the things that were outlined for fossil fuels, to perhaps, I don't know, buy off or pay to transform the food system into a more regenerative, resilient system that's beneficial to farmers and consumers and animals and the biosphere. The problem is that there are, in the present situation, vested interests against it. The big agrochemical companies and even the fossil fuel companies and grain trading companies have a vested interest in the way it is now, with high external inputs and lots of externalized costs. And I'm wondering if there's a similar thing we could do if we were willing to foot the bill to kind of pay them to change their approach, because consumers and farmers will change their approach if we just maybe loosen up some regulations and let certain prices become more normalized. I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on how we can do something for agriculture like Saul is proposing for energy.
I think there, politically, Creon, we're in a little better shape than energy. And the reason is the ag lobbies, the corn growers, scare congressmen and scare senators in a really strong way. Those are they're like farmers are basic, well-to-do farmers are some of the most powerful local community organizers in their areas. And, I think this was even the story of saving ARPA-E from being the Trump budget cuts, is like, fortunately, because of the agriculture program, the grower association showed up, and then those Republicans did not want to be on the record saying they were opposed to something the growers associations wanted. And we also have this opportunity, as you're implying, with this bailout to say, can we make an alliance with farmers and say, you can be part of the climate solution, right? And we have the possibility of making a grand political bargain where we bring in parts of the country that have not traditionally been motivated to do something about climate change as part of the political coalition that is now has skin in the game for increasing soil carbon, for decreasing nitrous oxide emissions, and so forth.
And let's not underappreciate the links between agriculture and energy on multiple fronts. A huge number of farms are currently underwriting themselves with generating wind in concert with what they're doing. That has to grow enormously. Really, there's no way to get to total decarbonization without a fairly significant amount of biofuels to decarbonize some of the hard to decarbonize end use sectors like aviation.
But also, if we decarbonize the inputs to agriculture, it seems like that would be at least of some significance. If they're not using so much diesel and so much Haber-Bosch, nitrate fertilizers, and they'll be more profitable and more regenerative.
That would be great. And to contextualize those, about 1% of US energy is in making pesticides and herbicides. About 0.75% is in making nitrogenous and sulfurous pesticides. And nearly 1% of US energy flow is on-farm diesel use. So,
and what about Haber-Bosch nitrates? That's significant as well, I believe.
That's about 0.75%.
Okay.
And on top of that, you have, I think, 3 or 4% for the nitrous oxide emission that comes off of fertilizers, right? And if you had a biological nitrogen fixation, you'd expect that to at least have, with a lot of those emissions occurring from fertilizer right when you put it in the ground, right? You get 30% of your emissions right then. And so if you can find a better way to provide that fertilizer through microbes, you're going to get rid of those emissions.
And anyway, back to the point, I think there's a huge, all of these things indicate I think you have to build the biggest tent possible around the politics of climate change, and agriculture should be a very natural ally. And we have only done a middling job of drawing those connections historically.
Yeah, I think, David, you mentioned, what would it look like if farmers became part of the solution? Could you kind of because I think in the previous times that you were on, you had this I think pretty pragmatic stance of trying to get buy-in from those that on the surface seem opposed, but should actually be part of the solution. So perhaps you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, when farmers care a lot about their land, they want that land to go to their communities and their children and be farmed successfully for 60 years. So the natural allies really to the idea of having sustainable practices. The verbiage around it sometimes isn't what they relate to, and they're just really caught by the fact that they can't. If they do something better for the environment, it doesn't make their balance sheet look better that year, and because they're in a commodity market, they get squeezed. And you can solve those kind of problems in commodity markets by altering our government programs that help out farmers, which we've been doing in every developed country in the world has been doing for 100 years to solve various problems related to inefficiencies in the agricultural market. And so if we just change our focus, I think we'll find that they're some of the best allies we can have for preventing climate change.
Yes, I fully agree with that. I'd like to say two things on that. One is that, yes, it seems to me in my limited study, what I have found by listening to farmers and people who work in this field, that almost the lowest hanging fruit for pivoting at a large scale nationally to regenerative agriculture is changing some of the subsidies and insurance programs that the federal government offers, which currently incentivize industrial monocrops to a much greater extent, and they're not even set up to incentivize or insure polyculture and regenerative ag. So that's a simple thing we can do. And even a lot of the younger people in government in the USDA know this now, and it's just a matter of unwinding the regulatory capture and the inertia. That's a low-hanging thing we can do. And another very interesting meta point here, which I'm super excited about, I have found in studying regenerative ag and its proponents that it is one of the only places where you can see a really heartfelt, honest alliance and cooperation happening between leftists and rightists, if you will, between Trump state, farmers, conservatives, and environmentalist liberals, right? They both agree on this about, as Saul said, I believe, or maybe it was David, increasing the value of their land, making their farms regenerative and sustainable and able to pass on through the generations and not have all the small farm holdings just evaporate into large mega corporations. There's agreement between the left and the right, between the liberals and the conservatives, between the Democrats and the Republicans on this, and it's one of the only places I've seen it.
Okay, so we're now at 59. For whomever would like to stay on longer, you're definitely welcome to. But I want to kind of be mindful of the time of the panelists here. Maybe in closing words, what could you kind of like be as concrete as possible in terms of who do you think should be activated in this? Who would really be the people that could benefit right now by making change in the directions that you proposed?
If we don't elect somebody who's not Donald Trump, you can kiss goodbye to any planet you want to live on. You have 1 year. So everybody who votes needs to be activated, and it's in every country in the world. Australia just proposed yesterday a jobs creation bill post-COVID that would create 85,000 jobs in natural gas. If Australia does that, that's because it's exporting natural gas all over the world, and that alone will fuck us. We need, not to put it bluntly, you need political activation on a scale we have never seen before, and we need to overthrow governments in 4 or 5 critical countries in the next 12 months. Otherwise, we should just retire and drink wine and watch it burn.
All right. Well, that's uplifting and quite concrete and quite practical. David, do you have anything to add?
I would add to Saul's point that these elections are critical. Not only do we have to win the elections, which is winning the war, we have to win the peace. And that means we need to start making these plans that are very concrete about how do we implement a Green New Deal once there's political support. What do we do for a new kind of farm bill that puts sustainability at the center? And that work from a technocratic perspective has to start now, because if we're not ready for the moment, we'll miss it.
And to double down on that, you have to face the difficult questions head on, like the issue of proven reserves. You can't ignore these things and imagine that some liberal wave of the pen makes them go away.
I thank the two of you for excellent suggestions. I would like to make one which is smaller, I think, but is something that individuals can certainly do and which might help with the elections and the concrete plans, and that is realize, all of us kind of liberal city people, that we do have allies in the conservative rural people. They're not our enemies. We actually have common ground, particularly around fixing agriculture. And once you start thinking that way, whether you're liberal or conservative, once you start viewing nature as something you should love, which farmers do when they're on the right ground, if you will, that makes for a positive way forward. And COVID is an opportunity here, because I think this last thing I'm going to say, I think all these things about the meatpacking plants and the food shortages is actually good news. It's time we woke up to the fact that our food system is fragile, and that it's fragile because it's just like our medical equipment manufacturing system is fragile. It's fragile because of over-centralization, over-industrialization, and lack of resiliency and lack of distributed infrastructure. So it's an opportunity to fix some of these things.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to close out the official panel with this now. Whoever would like to stay on is certainly super welcome to. We're now going to go into a little bit more like informal participant-induced sharing. I think one question that came up by Mike. I don't know, Mike, if you want to unmute yourself just now. And, to all panelists, this is now officially, thank you so much for joining on such a short notice and with such a kind of pretty ambitious topic. And I would love potentially to, I don't know, probably your slides are going to be in the book, so I don't want to mess with that yet. But thank you for showing them so quickly. I would love to go to Mike, who had a question here, and maybe the panelists are still going to be on at that point, maybe not, but then we can crowdsource it from the audience. Mike, is it okay if I unmute you? You just had a question.
Oh, okay. Why, thanks. Yeah, I was really interested in hearing more about David's Pivot Bio. and how that's coming. I really like the idea of actually we can sequester more of the carbon and improve the growth and reduce the use of the fossil fuels, by using this nitrogen fixing bacteria. I saw it mentioned, like, for instance, we need a way to make ammonia. Well, this nitrogen fixing bacteria approach, essentially you're growing the ammonia in the ground using this biological process. So I was wondering if we could hear more about that with Pivot Bio and what they're doing.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So fertilizer is responsible for 5% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and it's basically irreducible unless you directly address fertilizer, right? So that's the first part you should know. In terms of what we're doing, we find microbes that already like to adhere to corn, and then we engineer them so that when in an environment of a large amount of nitrogen, they continue to produce nitrogen, right? Because most microbes, when they see abundant nitrogen, are like, I'm going to no longer produce it. We're now in our second year of sales across the United States of America, and our first gen product replaces roughly 10% of the nitrogen fertilizer applied, and we have this pipeline of trying to make microbes that work better and better and better, and can hopefully get us to the point where we get 50% or 100% replacement of synthetic fertilizer with microbial nitrogen.
That's great. And do the bacteria or the microbes, do they reproduce naturally?
Yeah. So basically, plants put sugar into the rhizosphere, the area around the roots, kind of like how, and they feed the microbes there for all sorts of symbiotic reasons, just kind of like how we have a gut microbiome that gets fed off of the sugars that we digest from our food. And they basically grow off of that and colonize and reproduce. So you don't have to make one microbe for every unit of fertilizer. You make a very small number of microbes and help them grow with the plant.
By the way, the soil rhizosphere, the soil microbiome, is by some estimates the largest fraction of the microbiome on Earth by mass, and hence by flux.
That's interesting. So it's not just legumes, but kind of any plant like corn.
Yeah. So we do have a project in working on leguminous nitrogen fixers as well, but our main work is on these plants that traditionally didn't have any nitrogen fixation.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I hope that really takes off.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. I think I posted the website at the beginning of this chat all the way up. If you want to scroll, I can also post again. Okay, next one up. I think I saw someone like literally waving with a hand here. I think Howard. Howard, I'm not sure if you're still here. Let's see. Maybe I'm just not finding you. Okay, can't find you now. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment, has a question? Feel free to raise your hand via the Zoom feature or act by literally raising your hand or say so in the chat. I heard a little bit of discussion about drawdown. We could, if anyone would like to chime in on that, please feel free. I think David Grossoff, you had a question at the beginning. Do you still want to ask that?
Okay. What can we expect from people to sort out different proposals? Presumably there's enough experience between Saul and David and Creon that you get an idea of what people understand and don't. And probably an oddly high number of people at this gathering have some familiar with the collision of their intuitions about how systems work and like what really happens with an exponential event. But that is really, really not intuitive. And most people's intuitions, as represented by Twitter and Facebook posts, everyone's linear. People don't understand delays bite you in the ass and all kinds of silliness. How do people, what have you guys learned, or what do you hope for to help people sort out and navigate an understanding of complex system dynamics on which this emergency depends, like for any rational course of action?
I'd like to say two things on that very quickly. One is that one thing that I've learned for better or for worse, is that for many people, including my friends my friend circle, who I mostly thought were very intelligent, are as guilty as anyone of just coming into these things with their emotional biases all preloaded, and practically any solution you talk about or any proposal you talk about, it's almost predictable what their response is going to be. It's going to be based on their emotional bias and not so much on data. And of course, I've recognized I'm the same way. So this is the thing that we have to be eternally vigilant against, but not even very optimistic that we can fix in short order. But it's just pervasive. And then the other, and by the way, these biases are not just emotional. Some of them are biological and genetic, and it's just really crazy. Then the other thing that I was going to say, which is perhaps a little more positive, is that the one thing I've also learned is that you have to take a systems approach. Tending to focus on one technological magic bullet is almost certain to be insufficient. And so just for biology, you certainly need a systems approach. And the way Saul looks at it for sort of large-scale industrial and economic flows, you need a systems approach. And I wish I had something more concrete to say. But almost anyone who's pushing a single technological solution to all problems, I suspect, is deluding themselves or trying to delude others.
Apart from the great technological approach, the her that you mentioned of nature.
The one true technology.
The one true technology. All right. Okay. Anyone else? David, do you want to chime in on that question?
I would just end up echoing what Creon said about really needing a portfolio approach and a systems approach, and also trying to think through how your structures create winners without picking winners, which is politically quite dangerous. I personally like CAFE standards, like fuel economy standards, I think are one of the great success stories for environmental regulation, in which we've, and I'm hoping we apply those to the entire economy. And so does every Democratic candidate for who ran for president other than Amy Klobuchar.
Do you have any other kind of like lines of alignment, which, where basically I think where it seems that where we're actually closer to each other than it seems on the surface? Like, you seem to be quite hopeful, actually, that, and Creon too, right? That there is actually a ton of overlap. Could you make that more explicit for people who may not be able to see?
I can say one thing very quick, which is that for instance, as you well know, Allison, out in, the rural counties, say of California, where we've been spending a fair bit of time recently, we have neighbors who are conservative. But they are conservative to a large extent in the original meaning of the word conservative. They want to conserve nature. They want to have beautiful, healthy, productive, enjoyable wilderness. And the fact that they're Republicans should not prevent us from aligning with them, because we have common ground in at least those areas.
I guess when I talk to people everywhere about politics, no matter if they're on the red team or blue team, they're all saying a lot of the same things about what they're upset about. They're upset about a government that doesn't serve them. They're upset about not being represented. They want their communities to thrive. They want problems to be able to be dealt with. And so, I am hopeful that our current political, brutal two-party sport can eventually be superseded, where we work together to solve the common problems that we all have.
Yeah, I think it's a nice way of saying this, but there's actually I'm posting the link to the talk, and here a really good talk by Eric Drexler on Paretopian goal alignment. So those are it's like a, I guess, more formal way of actually proposing this as a meta strategy of how to kind of get everyone what they want and growing the pie at the same time. So I just posted a link to that, and I think it's a strategy that doesn't only help in the current topic that we're discussing, but I think it's something that whichever side you're on, if you actually want to make it easy for people to agree, then I think finding those points of goal alignment would be a good one. So thank you for that. I don't know if anyone else has any additional comments. Feel free to raise your hand. I'm seeing a few. Sandra, it's so sweet how some people are actually raising their hands. Sandra, I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Just wanted to say thank you for an incredibly great discussion today. Very thought-provoking, very intellectual, well-grounded, very excited about everything I heard. The comment I want to make is kind of a meta comment, and that has to do about our relationship with the land, with the water. Water is life is something that we hear oftentimes from indigenous peoples from around the world, and in Hawaii, there's the concept of the relationship with the Aina, with the land. And so as I was listening to so many things today, as we think about our connectedness, not just to each other and all of our different ways of doing things, and maybe oftentimes being in conflict, but just thinking about how connected we are both to each other, and then how connected we are to our planet, our land, our water, our air, and just upping that level of awareness and the way in which we discuss it with each other is very, very helpful. But today's discussion on the intellectual level and the technical level was absolutely great. Gives me more data to work with. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, though, I think that one of the things that can be coming out of COVID-19 is that many people who are usually quite urban are moving to rural places, are spending time there. There's now this kind of like new word, techno-rural, right? And basically a friend of mine here in San Francisco told me that there's almost no day that passes where he doesn't see a ton of moving vans, going through the city. So it really seems like there's this exodus happening, which, we can argue about how good or bad that is, right? But for one, it may decrease rent prices. On the other hand, it also, I think, creates this kind of like interesting mix of much of the elite that, even in San Francisco, many people here go hiking, and it's this like eternal conversation topic that you have. But nevertheless, many people are now spending much more time actually kind of like in closer contact with nature. I think may kind of like unlock a very different type of care and concern on those fronts as well. So I think even though it's really hard to quantify or put in words, that may be one of the benefits coming out of COVID-19. Also, yeah, all right, thanks. Okay, I thought I saw another hand. I've got to Mark Stove. I'm going to unmute you too. Oh, and then Josh Freeman. Mark Stove.
So thanks. This was wonderful. I'm worried that we don't have, I've said this before, enough of an Asian perspective. And I wonder if any of the panelists would talk about activism and developments in Asia that are hopeful. Asia, for example, has most of the world's rice production, and rice's fields are a source of methane, which rarely gets talked about. Anyway, where can we somehow loop in some Asian perspective?
Do you have particular suggestions? Because I'm taking suggestions for people who should be on this. I don't think it should all be North America centered. So please, if anyone has particular names, then let me know.
Well, I know that there are some, let's see, David, you're still here, great. I know that there's some recent stuff on techniques, both sort of traditional and technological, to drastically reduce methane emission from rice paddies. And that's super important because I think that's one of the major sources of methane in the world.
So I don't know someone in particular, but I do know the person who did methane observation work for the UN. He probably would, he's not the sort who'd want to be on a panel, but he would know and a lot of that work was on rice. And so I'm sure he might be willing to suggest a name or two.
Yeah, I think I was kind of like hijacking that question. The question, I think, was more like, can you channel someone with an Asian perspective and right now say what they would be saying to this?
Oh, I see. Probably not. The politics around rice are very complicated, and I don't want to pretend I understand them.
Okay, great. Mark Stowe, do you have a suggestion yourself? Because it seemed like, sometimes when there's a question, there's already like a hint at an answer. I want to hear from you. I'm going to unmute you. Trying hard to unmute him. Maybe he's refusing. Okay, Mark, if you want to be unmuted. Oh, now you are unmuted.
So thank you. I don't know people who are directly involved enough, but I could perhaps start to put out feelers.
Okay, great. Then let's see. We had Josh Freeman. You had your hand up, but now it's down again. Is it still up? Yes, I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, David. Brown. I was hearing you talk about agriculture. I was thinking about ideas you had, like to improve local agriculture. I live out in the country of Massachusetts. If you have any ideas about that.
In what sort of farming do you do? Or what sort
of farm? But we have a few farms. I grow a few chickens. Yeah. But we have a few local farms. So I'm just thinking about ways to improve just local agriculture.
Oh, there's so much on that. I mean, take a look at that list of. I don't know if you saw it on the chat. I'll post it here again. I put a list. I've looked at like literally hundreds and hundreds of hours of videos and read hundreds of papers over the last year and a half on regenerative ag. And I down selected it to maybe 1 or 2 dozen really beautiful videos, and particularly by farmers and stuff like that who've jumped on board this. And if you want to take a look at what I'm going to repost in the chat channel here, it's sort of a curated list of videos and a few papers on regenerative ag that are super inspiring and show a lot of stuff in a lot of different farms. There's a whole variety of different things. There's a great deal of sort of local particularization that has to be done. There's no one size fits all in regenerative ag. I will mention one thing, though. We didn't get Josh Wheaton onto this call. Maybe we get him onto another one in the future, Alison. But he has pointed out, according to his analysis, the largest carbon, how can I say this? The biggest part of the carbon footprint of your average city dweller who's not doing a ton of commuting is the kitchen scraps that get buried in landfills. And that if you just don't throw away your kitchen scraps, but instead feed them to chickens and turn them into eggs, basically, and eat the eggs, you've largely collapsed your carbon emissions. So that's very interesting, and it's certainly very rewarding.
Thanks. I did not know that. David, I don't know if you want to chime in.
I don't think I have a particular thing to add on that would be better than reading through Creon's well-researched list.
Okay, great. Is there anyone else who'd like to share or chime in or ask a question? Okay. I don't see. Oh, wait. I saw one from Mike in the chat. Mike, I will unmute you if you don't mind, and you can ask it.
And Mark has hand raised, I think.
But I think Mark, I just took him, so I'm assuming that hand was raised from before.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was kind of wondering if there's been any reports about methane production, comparing the methane from livestock and from the rice paddies compared to natural sources like swamps, wetlands.
Yeah, I can answer that to some extent because I'm involved at Planet Labs with remote sensing, and one of the things we're getting into is remote sensing of methane, and so this is a real critical question because it not only depends like which are the big emitters, but in a way there's a more important question, which is the Pareto question, Alison, which is if you have a set of emitters of different classes that are emitting different amounts, which are the ones that you could go after first that would get 80% of the benefit for 20% of the effort. And the problem is going after, even if let's say rice paddies were the big emitter, you're not going to fix all rice paddies worldwide anytime quickly. However, if what you find is, for instance, like we are finding in, say, the US, that there's a small fraction of natural gas processing and storage facilities and a small fraction of confined animal feed operations and garbage dumps that are, there's maybe 50 or 100 of these, and they're doing a lot of emissions from the US's perspective. Well, that's nice because you can go after these 50 or 100 emitters and either incentivize them or shame them into cleaning up their act. And that's much easier than going after a billion rice paddies worldwide. So there's the question of how much is being emitted by various sources in the diagrams that Saul shows. And then there's the question of, where are the 20% that you can go after to stop 80% of the emissions. And that's really what's important. And that's where remote sensing comes in, because we don't fully know these answers.
Thank you. Next one up, we had George O'Billion with a question. George, I'm gonna find you. Oh, there you are. Mute.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask about the release of methane from melting permafrost and how that factors into the methane analysis.
I posted a link right now from on the Mulago Foundation, which is Olya. She's a dear friend and in San Francisco. She actually went out and went on her own exhibition to kind of to see how much is actually out there and measure it. And I think in 2 self-funded expeditions, she went out there and was just totally startled when she came home. And based on her findings, she's launched this project now, which is really, I think it's quite insane. And I just want to plug her here. It's she's been doing really fantastic work with it. But
she has been, and she's been also working on some ways to actually burn off some of this methane and turn it into CO2. The issue between how bad is methane and how bad is CO2, there's a lot of subtleties there in terms of the time frame that you're looking at. And methane has a very different dynamic in the atmosphere than CO2. It's taken out of the atmosphere much more quickly than CO2. There's a ton of stuff on livestock and methane that people misunderstand because they don't understand the dynamics. But again, with Olya's thing and the permafrost methane and the bubbling lakes and all this, in a way, we can't fix that. I mean, other than fixing the entire warming problem, there's nothing we can do about the permafrost methane. We can go after gross polluters of methane in our industrial infrastructure. And I at least believe that that's where we should be targeting right now.
Yeah. I mean, that doesn't really solve the problem, right? If it's still there, it's still there.
Right.
I think yeah.
This kind of gets to the challenge that Saul was saying, is that once beyond 2 degrees of global warming, there are all these unknown knowns, right? We know methane hydrates from underwater could be a problem. We know permafrost methane could be a problem. Very hard to know how big a problem and exactly when they will become a problem. That is part of the motivation to try and stay below this 2 degrees. Is there's enough nonlinearity in the system that we have a hard time predicting.
No, I totally don't mean to imply that I have a good idea about this at all, but I do think that people should check out The Precipice by Toby Odd. It's a book that he wrote where he's specifically talking about climate change as a potential existential risk, and I think he comes down on the fact that it isn't a direct one, but he goes a little bit into that issue of runaway greenhouse effect and is trying to put numbers on it. He prefaces it with the fact that those things are really, really hard to know, but I think it's the most sensible the most sensible discussion of this topic that that I've seen recently. And so and I mean it's also super sobering, but yeah, I think it's something that on the long run we really can't ignore, because given the fact that we haven't been doing a super duper fantastic job wartime effort on steering the ship, I don't really see a way out in how we won't be facing the problem down the road.
Yeah.
Allison, thank you. I have to leave. I love
Alrighty. It's now also 2 minutes before 30. So, hey, David, I can't thank you enough also for having stayed on so long. And thank you all to all participants for your incredible questions. It was really, really, really fantastic. I certainly see a lot of people, even in the discussion who could almost be on a panel like this. So thank you. I really, really, really appreciate it. I hope you have a lovely Friday. I want to say before closing out a few things about next week because we are continuing. There was a continuous discussion with many people who really wanted us to go on. If you want to check out already on what we have kind of like rolling in for next week, that should be on the Google Calendar already, and it's on the program that I think many of you have access to. If you don't, email me and I'll give you access. But if you want to have a sneak peek on what's available next week, we have some really exciting things on Monday. We have Mindy, who was on here for Sense Making Salon previously, and Jamie, and they're actually going to walk us through. Jamie's going to walk us through specific argument change about COVID argumentation. Mindy is going to walk us through how we can create an infinity Hivemind map of the projects that you all are working on. So there will be a question there you can fill in your project, and then he's going to try to graph it out so as to get more collaboration amongst all of you going. It's Monday. Tuesday, we have Daniel Schmachtenberger at 6 p.m., so it's a different time. And that would just be a Q&A, so get your questions ready. That will be on sense making. I think many of you here probably know him. Then we have a variety of, I think Creon will be on again on an immunology deep dive on Wednesday. And then from there on, we may do something on TMS with Michael on Thursday. Let's see. And there is a few things kind of like in discussion for Friday as well. So I'm hoping that I'll see many of you again next week. Let's see how long we can keep this going. It's kind of like at this point becoming a perpetuum mobile, something like that. I don't know if I can ever stop. Thank you all for making it so worth it. Thank you all for kind of like for really enabling all of those salons. Mindy, I can't wait to see you on Monday. Bye. Have a lovely weekend and take some rest. Bye, everyone.